In this video, we're going to talk about how cholera and cystic fibrosis affect water relations in the small intestine of humans. Cholera is a bacteria. Cholera is infected by a virus, which ironically gives it the capacity to produce a toxin. This toxin interacts with a receptor on brush border cells, the VIP receptor, that is typically used to receive information from the body telling it it's time to do the dishes. So VIP comes into this receptor and a little AC activation occurs, a little cyclic AMP is made, and that leads to a quick release of water right at the surface of the brush border cells so that the mucus is washed away after meals. But when cholera toxin enters this receptor, that leads to a massive increase in the activity of adenylate cyclase. Adenylate cyclase turns ATP, would be the substrate, into cyclic AMP. That would be the product. When cyclic AMP levels rise, that leads to the opening of chloride channels. It also leads to the closure of sodium channels. So chloride can't move through. Chloride now can move through. Sodium now can't move through the membrane. It's also true that it stops both sodium or chloride from entering through the co-transporter. Cyclic AMP, in addition, turns off the sodium proton antiporter. So what happens when these pieces of equipment are changed, when sodium isn't allowed in, when sodium and chloride are not allowed in, when chloride is let out? So that is a net of something leaving that doesn't typically, and a couple of things not entering that do typically. Well, of course, what this does is, since now there is less solute in the cell, it increases the osmotic potential of the cell. Why did chloride leave? Well, you don't know necessarily about the concentration of chloride in this situation, but you certainly know that it's going with charge. So it may or may not be going with concentration, but it's certainly going with charge. Sodium fails to enter, despite the fact that both charge and concentration want it to enter. And the sodium chloride co-transporter fails to let things in, all because cyclic AMP levels have gone up. Okay, so when the osmotic potential of these cells rise, the osmotic potential is no longer lower than the osmotic potential out in the lumen here of the small intestine. That's what's outside of this cell. And so water no longer enters through these aquaporins, and 8 liters of water are placed into the small intestine by the other digestive organs every day. And if you have 8 liters of water that's not being taken up by the small intestine, you quickly die of dehydration. Luckily, cyclic AMP does not interact with every membrane-spanning machine. It does not interact with, for instance, the sodium-glucose co-transporter. And that's why rehydration therapy uses sodium and glucose in concentrations that are just right so that these are taken up quickly by the cell, and when that happens, it doesn't get rid of the cholera, it doesn't stop the chloride channel from being open, but it lets and forces more and more sodium and glucose into the cell, which, counters this issue, lowers the osmotic potential some. So there's still some diarrhea going to occur, but it's not going to be a fatal amount because sodium and glucose can enter the cells and contradict the effect of all that chloride leaving. The cystic fibrosis gene, CFTR, is this chloride channel. When you have a heterozygote for cystic fibrosis, there are fewer chloride channels in the brush border membranes. When that is the case, less chloride is lost, more water reuptake occurs, and so the symptoms of cholera are much less likely to be fatal. That's an advantage for being heterozygous for cystic fibrosis. But if you are homozygous for cystic fibrosis, chloride can never exit these cells, and the dryness that ensues around the surface of the brush border becomes fatal. But cystic fibrosis prevents these cells from doing the dishes.